Salutations, prospective viewers. I'm George from Ireland. This video is about Brexit. What is going on? That's the topic, because many people are mystified as to what is happening. Well, Brexit Day should have been 2 days ago, but it was delayed by anything from 2 weeks to 8 weeks, depending on whether Parliament ratifies the agreement that Theresa May made with the European Union. So Theresa May has already failed thrice to get this thing through the House of Commons. Of course, the House of Lords could delay by up to a year, but that's it. And people haven't really engaged with that eventuality. What if it's delayed by a further 12 months by the Lords, who are heavily Remain? And remember, the House of Lords is not elected, and so they don't have to worry about public opinion. Just think, I mean, the House of Commons was about 80% Remainers before the referendum, and then some of them were Remainers like Theresa May, who said, okay, we'll accept the majority more than a few hardline Remainers in the House of Commons who'll say, no, we're just always going to vote no, or we'll just find any excuse to vote to stay in the European Union, pretending, oh, it's because the deal isn't quite good enough, tweak it. So it appears to have polarised the situation. There were really three options. That was leave the European Union without an agreement, leave the European Union with an agreement, or stay in the European Union. But Theresa May's option of trying to get this agreement through Parliament seems to be failing, which polarised it. You have to go to either extreme, either remain in the European Union or leave the European Union without an agreement. I was minded to go for that via media. The one thing is, Theresa May seems to be determined to ram it through. The option she doesn't seem to have considered is actually staying in the European Union after all. So I have to doff my cap to her for iron will. And now, I said a couple of months ago that I thought Brexit would not happen. I'm becoming less sure about that one. Because people are saying to Theresa May, you can just cancel Article 50. The United Kingdom could unilaterally say, actually, we're staying in the European Union, and the UK would immediately be accepted in the European Union on the current terms. No need for renegotiation. The European Court of Justice confirmed that a few months ago. Anyway, so Theresa May, she inherited the premiership in July 2016. Now it appears to be in a hospital pass because it was his nightmarish mission to try and get the UK out of the European Union while securing a deal that was accepted to Parliament. So the Remain prejudice of Parliament is stronger than I had realised. And so she's had all these indicative votes on what would you accept if you won't agree to this deal put forward by the European Union. And the European Union said they're not going to tweak it anymore. Obviously, it's a bit of a headache for the European Union if the United Kingdom leaves without an agreement, because it's going to impact on their trade as well. Now, the repercussions for the EU won't be as negative as for the UK, because the EU is bigger, sort of almost 500 million people to the UK's 70-odd million. And other things. Well, should there be a customs union or not? That's now being considered. Well, thing is, as I say, it's polarising, but some people are changing in directions you might not expect. Jacob Rees-Mogg, who was the archpriest of hard Brexit, is now saying that he might vote for this agreement because a half a loaf is better than no loaf at all. And Nigel Dodds, a DUP politician, he represents a constituency in Northern Ireland, he said that he would prefer staying in the European Union. Remember, he was always a leaver, because leaving the EU seems to risk Northern Ireland's place within the United Kingdom. Anyway, so 5 million people have signed a petition to say cancel Article 50. So the UK will stay in the European Union after all. Of these 5 million, do we know that they're registered voters? I don't think we have any proof of who they are. Do we know that they're over 18? They might be under the voting age. Do we know that they're British citizens or Commonwealth citizens or some way entitled to vote? We don't know that. Do we know that it's not one person who's done this hundreds of times? I don't think it's been verified. So really, this has no electoral significance whatsoever. And it's richly ironic for these Remainers saying, disregard public opinion. Oh, accept this petition. You can't have it both ways. Make up your mind. So Donald Tusk said, you cannot betray the 5 million who signed the petition. Oh, but you can betray the 17 million who voted for Brexit, the largest democratic act in British history. There's never been an election with that many votes. There was one UK-wide, well, two UK-wide referenda before that, and the last one was on alternative vote, had a much lower turnout. Way back the 1975 one, I don't actually know the turnout figures, but the population was lower back then. But Euro fanatics, they sent an opportunity. Some of them are smelling victory. They might be able to thwart Brexit altogether. At the 11th hour, they think that possibly they can prevent it happening. And people like David Lammy have been calling for that for day one. So people are saying there's chaos. Well, there's not chaos. The economy is still growing. Government is functioning. There's nowhere near chaos. And now it's true that that Parliament is being refractory, and the legislature is certainly holding the executive to account and standing up for itself, asserting its rights. MPs are entitled to vote against the government. In many ways, that's a very salubrious thing, that there's real democracy, that they are not the lackeys of the Prime Minister. They can do what they want. So we ought to be celebrating that, not distraught that it's happening, but one way or other, Brexit's going to happen, Theresa May can say, with an agreement or without. And it's up to the House of Commons to decide. So it shows that Parliament is really, this is no rubber stamp. Party discipline is breaking down, and that's been perhaps the most fascinating development, and maybe the one which will have the most long-lasting effects. Because people say, the Conservatives are in disarray. To some extent, that's true. Obviously, the handful of extremist Remainers broke away to form that independent group, Anna Soubry and so forth. There was the European Research Group, of which Rees-Mogg was a luminary. And in the middle are various moderate Leavers, moderate Remainers who are trying to vote for the agreement, but the middle is not that big. And in Labour, there's some difficulty, only a handful voting for Theresa May's deal. But mostly the Remainers of some kind, but they can't agree. Should they have another referendum? Should they just rule out Brexit altogether? Should they vote for some kind of deal, a more acceptable one, stay in the customs union or the European free trade area? It's all highly technical and complex, and of course the man on the street doesn't understand all this. So another election, Tom Watson has said that, a very prominent Labour frontbencher. But of course he would say that because an opposition should always want an election. I mean, they're chickens if they don't, because they want to form the government. They should want an election at any time, an opportunity to serve. So even if they don't actually want an election, they've got to pretend as though they do. And they might say, we're not going to get a better situation than this. Because when Theresa May's gone, and that'll be in a couple of months, there will be a new leader, Tory leader, who'll come in a bit of a honeymoon, probably be more effective, be hard to be more ineffectual than her. And if Brexit is finally off the agenda, if this is a done deal, one way or the other, the Conservatives can get back to concentrating on more bread and butter issues like health and crime and the economy and education and whatever else. So the SNP, they spotted a chance to have another referendum on Scotland's position within the United Kingdom. But that doesn't seem to be on the agenda now. They're a bit demoralised. The thing is, if there was another election, it would be difficult for Labour to win outright. So they would have to have some sort of confidence and supply agreement with the SNP to come into government at all, and or a coalition with the Lib Dems. And the SNP might say, well, the price of that is a second referendum on the EU, and or a second referendum on Scotland's place within the UK, and that kind of thing. And the SNP could also point out, remember when the Scottish separation was voted down in 2014? That was on the explicit promise of Devo Max, which hasn't happened. That express avowal has been reneged on by Westminster. So at the SNP, they'd initially accepted the result of their referendum in Scotland that they lost, and oddly they become more popular. You think they go into the doldrums, but it hasn't happened. Just like UKIP has largely disappeared, I predict will dissolve within a 12-month. So Labour would quite like this issue settled before the next election, because it could tear them apart. Because they're a highly Remain party. About 90% of the politicians voted Remain. About half of them have now reluctantly accepted that the UK should leave. But many of them represent constituencies, particularly in Northern England, which are very much leave, and they would risk hemorrhaging votes to the Conservatives or people staying at home and things like that. So what their fudge, if there is an early election, is say a second referendum, the so-called people's vote. Almost as the first one wasn't a people's vote. But the opinion polls have shown that opinion has moved a bit towards Remain. Surprisingly little, considering all the kerfuffle. Remember, Remain got 48% of the vote in 2016, is now showing Remain on 55% of the vote, a rise of 7 percentage points. But remember, the poll of polls overrated Remain by 4 percentage points in 2016. Supposing that margin of error is replicated, that means Remain would not get 55%, would get 51% in a referendum, so they'd win. But of course, anything can happen at backgammon. A referendum hasn't been called. Depends on what happens and how spirited and persuasive the campaigns would be, if indeed this referendum is held at all. But the time is running out. And in order to do this, the UK would have to kick Brexit into the long grass. So one of the remaining strategies would be to delay and delay and delay and say, it's been over 3 years now and it hasn't happened. Do we actually need to leave? There's been a lot of water under the bridge. We need to reassess the whole situation. Remember, some people have turned 18 since then, and the very young are Remainers quite heavily. They break something like 70% towards Remain. And the very elderly who've died off in the last 3 years, they break heavily towards Leave. So there's a lot of dissatisfaction in the Labour Party with the way Corbyn's handled this. His heart wasn't in it when he was campaigning for Remain. Remember, until a few years ago, he wanted to leave the European Union. Way back in the 80s, there was the European Economic Community. The EEC was much less integrated than the EU is now. And Corbyn was against even the EEC. And he's known as being a zealous, passionate campaigner and an absolutely fantastic orator. So, but because May has had her travails, the public's been distracted from Corbyn's shortcomings. But Theresa May is going to be gone shortly, and the spotlight will be back on Corbyn and his difficulties. Remember, his party's already tried to defenestrate him once. Sir Vince Cable, the leader of the Liberal Democrats, of course, he's announced he's standing down. Should have been a golden opportunity for him. Remember, he was an outspoken Europhile. The Lib Dems are very Europhile. You'd think there would have been some mileage in being an avowedly Europhile party, but no. If you're a real Europhile, you've got to vote for them. And of course, their share of the vote went down in the last election, though in the seats they went up a tiny bit. They had so few seats it made as near as no difference. So Sir Vince Cable is rather elderly. He managed to be grandfatherly without ever being considered an elderly statesman. Just failed to connect. So who's going to be the next MP? Well, they say it's that very young Liberal Democrat woman. He's best known for his bon mot when he launches an absolute drone strike at Gordon Brown, saying Gordon Brown's gone from being Stalin to Mr. Bean. So the Twickenham MP will no longer be there. So will the issue be resolved in another 2 months, or will there be a second delay? The European Union might run out of patience. On the other hand, they might think there'll be a deathbed conversion to Remain in the United Kingdom. Will there be an early election? And we're saying that something like that would happen, or a referendum. So the UK could leave in about 8 weeks. But Theresa May might be thinking, well, I really have exhausted all possible options. We're beyond the deadline for 2 years, and the European Union is thoroughly sick of this and just would like it sorted. But again, the lack of panic is palpable, because Remainers were always telling us it's going to be a meltdown, it's going to be an absolute dystopia, we won't be able to get enough food, enough medicines, there's going to be a 100-mile tailback at Dover, the pound is going to crash, there's going to be mass unemployment. I don't hear those Jeremiads anymore. The doom-laden prognostications didn't come true about the exchange rate mechanism, or not joining the euro, or even voting to leave the EU, or even about to leave the EU. There's some people who said, just leave and sort it out later. And the government seems increasingly confident that they've got contingency plans in place, that it really wouldn't be too bad. So there's that. I think the Remainers, they've stopped scaremongering because they're recognising that it's actually not getting them anywhere, and it's undermining their credibility, not enhancing it. So, well, we certainly live in interesting times. So I think it will be resolved in 8 weeks, because the EU might say, well, you've got to stay long term, or you've got to leave. We just cannot have this come push me, pull me, blowing hot and cold with the EU, and the Tory party might be fed up with it. And they would then sort of steal a march on Labour and the Lib Dems, and once the UK is actually out, fully out, it'd be more difficult to get back in. Even this transitional arrangement saying, okay, we're at leave the European Union, but we'll carry on the trade arrangements for another 2 years, that's still out of the European Union. Of course, there's always the possibility of applying for readmission, the Treaty of Lisbon, under which the UK is leaving and voting Article 50, it specifically provides for the scenario wherein a member state departs the EU and then requests to be allowed back in, and it said that such a request will be considered. Of course, it doesn't guarantee the member state would be readmitted, and it might be on terms less favourable than it was previously a member. So there we have it. It's scintillating. So I'm now narrowly minded to say the UK actually will leave the EU. I could well be wrong. It's perhaps a fool's errand to make these predictions.